Welcome. Take a moment to settle in wherever you are. Tonight's story unfolds in Victorian London, where routine and order move quietly through fog-covered streets and along the iron rails of the railway. This is a calm, uninterrupted narrative, told from the perspective of Dr. John Watson, recounting one of Sherlock Holmes's lesser-known investigations. A case not of spectacle or violence, but of absence, structure, and the unnoticed spaces within familiar systems. There are no chapters and no breaks. Simply listen and allow the story to carry you forward at its own pace. When you are ready, the story begins. It has often seemed to me that the most consequential events do not arrive with force or announcement, but instead make themselves known quietly, almost tentatively, as though uncertain whether they deserve attention at all. In the winter of 1894, London existed in such a state of subdued persistence. Fog gathered in the streets each evening and lingered into the morning hours. Sounds were softened. Distances appeared shorter than they were. The city moved, but without urgency. It was during this period that I found myself again sharing rooms with Sherlock Holmes at Baker Street and observing in him a familiar but unsettled stillness. For several days he had neither sought diversion nor accepted any professional engagement. His violin remained untouched upon the mantel. The small chemical apparatus he so often employed stood in precise alignment, unused. He spent long intervals seated by the window, gazing down at the street below, his posture unchanged, his attention fixed. I had learned, through long experience, that such stillness did not indicate rest. Rather, it suggested a mind conserving itself, withdrawing slightly from the surface of things while remaining alert beneath. Holmes was never idle in the ordinary sense. When the world offered him nothing of interest, he waited. London, for its part, seemed reluctant to intrude. Cabs passed slowly. Footsteps echoed faintly and then dissolved into the fog. Even the occasional call of a street vendor sounded distant, as though coming from another quarter of the city entirely. It was therefore with mild surprise, though not alarm, that we received a visitor late one afternoon. Mrs. Hudson announced him with her usual discretion, remarking only that the gentleman believed his business to be urgent. The man who entered our sitting room was unremarkable in every visible respect. He was of moderate height, dressed plainly but with care. His coat was well maintained, though not new. His boots were clean, though worn. He carried himself with the quiet attentiveness of someone accustomed to procedures and schedules, rather than to uncertainty or confrontation. He removed his hat upon entering and hesitated briefly, as though uncertain how best to proceed. "My name is Edwin Carlyle," he said. "I am employed by the railway." Holmes acknowledged him with a slight inclination of the head and gestured toward a chair. Carlyle sat, holding his hat carefully in both hands. Holmes did not speak at once. He allowed the moment to extend, his gaze resting upon the visitor with a calm, assessing neutrality. I had seen this many times before, and recognized it as a deliberate pause, one intended not to unsettle, but to allow unnecessary details to fall away. When Carlyle began to speak, he did so with measured precision. "I am a route inspector," he said. "My responsibilities include carriage safety, staff conduct, and the review of incidents that occur during transit." Holmes listened without interruption. "3 weeks ago," Carlyle continued, "a passenger failed to arrive at her destination." He paused, as though expecting some reaction. Holmes gave none. The matter was initially dismissed, Carlyle went on. Errors of record, miscommunication. Such explanations are common. And insufficient, Holmes said quietly. Carlyle nodded. Yes. The passenger's name, he explained, was Margaret Ellison. She had boarded the overnight express bound for London at York. Her ticket had been checked, her luggage loaded. She had entered her compartment alone. The train arrived in London on schedule the following morning. Her compartment was empty. The door was secured from the inside. There were no signs of disturbance. No luggage remained. Holmes asked for the time. The train departed York shortly after 10 in the evening, Carlyle replied. The absence was discovered upon arrival at King's Cross, just after 6. Holmes asked where the compartment was located. Second class, Carlyle said, midway along the train. Holmes asked whether similar incidents had occurred. Carlyle hesitated, then answered carefully. There have been complaints, he said. Minor ones. Unexplained noises. Doors opening unexpectedly. Sensations of cold. Nothing conclusive. And always dismissed, Holmes said. Yes. Holmes rose and crossed the room, stopping briefly at the mantel before turning back toward our visitor. You have come to me, he said, because you believe this is not an error. Carlyle met his gaze. I believe it is a pattern. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a point already understood. When does the train next depart? He asked. Tonight, Carlyle said. Holmes reached for his coat. Then we shall observe. The journey that followed was uneventful in the conventional sense. We boarded shortly before midnight and settled into a compartment not far from the one previously occupied by Miss Ellison. The train departed on time, its motion steady and unremarkable. Holmes spoke little. He appeared content to listen to the rhythm of the wheels, to the subtle changes in sound as the train passed through open country and then through clusters of sleeping towns. I found the motion soporific, and would no doubt have slept, had Holmes not remained quietly alert beside me. Some time after 2 in the morning, he shifted slightly. Listen, he said. At first I heard nothing beyond the expected sounds of travel. Then, faintly, I became aware of a subtle change, a difference in the quality of the air, a coolness that seemed out of place within the enclosed space. Holmes rose and opened the compartment door. The corridor beyond was empty and dimly lit, extending in both directions without interruption. He stood there for several moments, attentive but unhurried. Then he closed the door again. That will suffice, he said. When we returned to Baker Street later that morning, Holmes said nothing further on the subject. Yet I knew the matter had already taken root. Whatever lay behind the disappearance was not dramatic nor chaotic. It was orderly, repetitive, embedded within the structure of something designed to function smoothly and without question. Holmes, I had learned, was most dangerous when confronted not by disorder, but by systems that worked too well. In the days that followed our journey, Holmes allowed the matter to unfold at its own pace. He neither summoned Carlyle nor sought further interviews with the railway officials. Instead, he occupied himself with small, deliberate tasks that appeared unrelated: reorganizing correspondence, revisiting old notebooks, requesting obscure technical manuals from circulating libraries. To the casual observer, he might have seemed disengaged. I knew better. One evening, as the lamps were lit and the fog pressed close against the windows, Holmes spread several documents across the table between us. They were diagrams of railway carriages, some current, some clearly outdated, annotated in his fine, economical hand. "Describe the carriage again," he said, without looking up. I obliged him, repeating what I could recall: the facing seats, the narrow corridor, the fixed windows, the sense of enclosure that made long journeys feel at once secure and confining. "And what lies between the visible interior and the exterior shell?" Holmes asked. "Structure," I said. "Insulation, wiring." "Yes," he replied. "And space." He tapped one of the diagrams gently. "Not space intended for occupation," he continued, "but space nonetheless. Modern engineering tolerates such things. It values adaptability over clarity." He explained that during refits and efficiency improvements, small voids were often created to allow access to cabling or reinforcement. Over time, these spaces were sealed, forgotten, and omitted from updated plans. They existed, but only in the most technical sense. "Anything that is not meant to be seen," Holmes said, "eventually ceases to be imagined." He folded the diagrams and set them aside. "This is not a crime of force," he added. "It is a crime of design." We travelled again 2 nights later, this time in a different carriage along the same route. Holmes wished to determine whether the phenomenon was confined to a single location or replicated elsewhere. The journey was quiet, the hours marked only by the steady passage of time and the gentle sway of the train. At approximately the same hour as before, the subtle change returned. A faint shift in temperature, a barely perceptible alteration in sound. Holmes rose and moved into the corridor. I followed at a respectful distance, mindful not to disturb the sleeping passengers behind their closed doors. He paused midway along the carriage and examined the wall closely. His fingers traced the seam between 2 panels, lingering where the join was slightly uneven. He pressed gently. The panel yielded, almost imperceptibly. "Here," he said softly. To my eyes, the wall appeared no different from any other. Yet under Holmes's scrutiny, its irregularities became apparent. The screws were newer than those elsewhere. The grain of the wood ran counter to the surrounding panels. It had been altered, carefully, deliberately. Holmes did not open it. He stepped back, satisfied. "That answers the question of possibility," he said. "Now we turn to opportunity." From that point onward, his attention shifted away from the carriage itself and toward those who moved within it. Staff schedules were obtained, rotations examined, patterns noted. One name appeared again and again, always present, always peripheral: Thomas Greer. Greer was a senior attendant. He had served the railway for many years without incident. His record was exemplary. He was punctual, discreet, and rarely mentioned in reports of any kind. "Invisibility," Holmes remarked, "is a form of access." We arranged a third journey, this time with careful preparation. A decoy passenger was placed in the compartment adjacent to the concealed panel, instructed only to sleep and to take note of anything unusual. Holmes and I positioned ourselves nearby, attentive but unobtrusive. The train moved through the night, as it always did. Time passed. Then, at precisely 23 minutes past 2, the change occurred again. There was a faint vibration, followed by a soft mechanical sound, controlled, practiced. Holmes stepped into the corridor. A section of the wall shifted outward, revealing a narrow opening. From within emerged a man, moving with deliberate care, as though accustomed to the confined space. It was Greer. He froze when he saw Holmes. For several moments, no one spoke. The train continued forward, indifferent to the quiet confrontation unfolding within it. "You need not run," Holmes said calmly. "There is nowhere to go that would improve your position." Greer's shoulders sagged. The moment passed without struggle. He was detained at the next station and handed over to the authorities. The mechanism was exposed. The void was revealed. The method was no longer in doubt. Yet Holmes remained unsatisfied. "He is not the origin," he said later as we returned to Baker Street. "Only the means." Greer confessed readily enough to his actions. He demonstrated the access point and described the procedure with a dull, mechanical resignation. He admitted to administering laudanum. He admitted to moving passengers into the concealed space. But he maintained one point with unwavering consistency. "I was shown," he said. "I did not design it." Holmes accepted this without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, the railway company moved swiftly to contain the matter. Inspections were ordered. Carriages were withdrawn. Statements were issued. The emphasis was placed firmly on correction rather than inquiry. Holmes, meanwhile, pursued a quieter line of investigation. Among the engineering records he obtained was the recurring trace of a name, one that appeared briefly, vanished, and then appeared again years later in a different context. Alfred Morrow. He was a consulting engineer. His engagements were short-lived, his presence transient. His work focused on efficiency, modification, and cost reduction. He specialized in improvements that left little visible trace. "He builds what others forget," Holmes said. We traced Morrow to a modest residence on the outskirts of London. When he answered the door, I saw at once that he was not a man prone to panic. His expression was guarded but controlled, his eyes sharp despite his age. Holmes spoke with him at length, discussing engineering challenges in abstract terms. Morrow responded cautiously, revealing little. It was only when Holmes produced one of the recovered diagrams that the man's composure wavered. "You understand," Holmes said evenly, "the danger of creating spaces without guardianship." Morrow did not reply. "You designed a feature," Holmes continued, "and taught another how to exploit it. You relied upon obscurity for protection." Morrow did not confess. He did not deny. He simply listened. Later, Holmes explained his conclusion to me. "Morrow created the condition," he said. "Greer enacted it. The railway permitted it. The responsibility, like the space itself, was distributed just thinly enough to evade firm grasp. In the end, the law acted where it could. Greer was prosecuted and removed from circulation. The voids were sealed. Standards were revised. Morrow departed quietly, leaving behind no more trace than his designs had. Holmes submitted his findings anonymously to the appropriate oversight bodies. The response was measured, procedural, and effective. When it was finished, he burned his notes. "The flaw has been addressed," he said. "That is sufficient. I have never since entered a railway carriage without a heightened awareness of its walls. They appear solid, reassuring, complete. Yet I know now that within systems built for efficiency, there are often spaces unaccounted for. Spaces that persist not through malice, but through neglect. Such spaces are seldom noticed until they are used." After the matter had settled, life at Baker Street resumed its familiar rhythm. The city outside continued much as it always had, its routines unbroken, its vast machinery indifferent to the small adjustments made within it. Trains departed and arrived according to schedule. Notices were printed and forgotten. Names faded from conversation. Holmes returned to his customary habits with an air of measured composure. He rose early, occupied himself with chemical experiments of a methodical nature, and spent long evenings reading technical treatises whose titles held little interest for anyone but himself. His violin, when he played it, produced slow and restrained passages, more structural than melodic, as though the instrument were another apparatus rather than a source of expression. He spoke of the case no further unless prompted, and even then only briefly. "There is nothing to be gained," he said once, when I ventured a question. "The mechanism has been corrected. The remainder is administrative." Yet I sensed, as I often did, that the affair had left its mark upon him, not in the form of regret or moral reflection, for such considerations rarely occupied his thoughts, but as a refinement of understanding. He had encountered not an adversary of intellect or passion, but an absence of oversight, a gap, something undefined. One evening, as the fog drifted low across Baker Street and the sounds of the city softened into a distant murmur, Holmes stood by the window in silence. His gaze rested upon the street below, though I suspected he was not observing it in any ordinary sense. "Watson," he said at last, "tell me, what do you suppose people trust most?" "The obvious," I replied. "What they see." "No," he said. "What they no longer notice." He turned slightly, though his eyes remained fixed upon the glass. "Systems earn trust through repetition. When something works reliably, it ceases to be questioned. Doors are assumed to lead only where they appear to lead. Walls are believed to contain only what is intended." "And when they do not?" I asked. "Then the failure is not sudden," Holmes said. "It has been accumulating for some time." He fell silent again, and I did not interrupt him. In the weeks that followed, reports reached us, quietly, indirectly, of new standards adopted across the railway network. Carriage designs were revised. Documentation was standardized. Inspections were expanded to include spaces previously ignored. None of this was dramatic. None of it was announced with ceremony. It was simply done. Miss Ellison's name appeared briefly in the papers, accompanied by a small notice and a formal expression of regret.
There was no explanation, only acknowledgement. Her family, I learned, accepted the settlement offered and withdrew from public view. Of Alfred Morrow, nothing more was heard. His departure was complete and unremarked. He left behind no public reckoning, only the silent removal of what he had created. As for Thomas Greer, his conviction passed with little comment. He was absorbed into the machinery of justice as quietly as he had once moved through the corridors of the train. Time, which resolves so little and obscures so much, moved on. I have often reflected since upon the nature of that case. It lacked the elements commonly associated with crime, no dramatic confrontation, no brilliant revelation delivered before an audience. Its danger lay not in violence, but in accommodation. It persisted because it aligned too easily with routine. Holmes, I believe, understood this better than I did at the time. For him, the matter was never personal. It was structural. He had uncovered not a villain in the traditional sense, but a vulnerability, a place where intention dissolved and responsibility blurred. Such discoveries did not trouble him emotionally. They sharpened him. For myself, the lesson was slower to settle. Even now, when I find myself travelling by rail, lulled by the steady rhythm of motion and the illusion of enclosure, I sometimes become aware of the walls, not as barriers, but as constructs. I think of what lies within them, and of what has been omitted by design or by neglect. The train continues forward. The night passes. The compartments remain quiet. And order, which so often reassures us, does so not because it is complete, but because we have learned where not to look. That, perhaps, is the most enduring mystery of all.
You have been listening to a quiet mystery set in the world of Sherlock Holmes, an original story inspired by the Victorian era. If you have drifted in and out of sleep, that is perfectly all right. The story was written to be followed loosely, without urgency. New stories are added regularly, each designed for calm listening, rest, or gentle focus. If this experience suited you, you are welcome to follow the channel or podcast so you can return whenever you wish. For now, rest easy and let the night continue at its own pace.